Hi everybody, this is Kent, and this is the post and beam greenhouse we built in the garden. And in this series of videos, I'm going to go through step by step how we put this together.
In the last episode of the series, I got the posts and beams cut, notched, and installed on the concrete foundation. We also put up the infill stud walls, the 4x4 doorway posts, and set the ridge beam in temporary supports. In this video, we will cut and install the rafters, add the polycarbonate glazing, and build the door. In my SketchUp model, I detailed the size, angles, and shape of the rafters I wanted to build. With the ridge beam now set, I need to double check my actual measurements and compare them to my drawing. And I will first record the distance from the top of the ridge beam down to the concrete footing in the center of the door. Then I'll measure from the corner of the north-south beam to a point on the ridge beam. And I also wanted to see if they were equal on both sides. I found that my actual numbers were very close to the model and drawing. I then cleaned up a 1x8 that I used for the foundation forms and cut a pattern for the rafters. Now I can take that pattern and trace the ellipse profile on the end of the cedar 2x6. And also mark the angle on the peak end. And I was orienting the cedar blanks with any bows toward the fence of the saw, so the crown of the rafters are all facing up. Like all of the other lumber on this build, these were milled from trees on our property and air dried for a few years, so there would be some warps and bows to deal with, but I did try to select the best stock I had. With those cuts done, I moved on to cutting the rafter tail profile with my jigsaw, clamping the 2x6s to sawhorses, then starting from the end and following my ellipse profile line. For the next step, I screwed some scrap 2x4s to sawhorses to make a slot to hold the rafters on their sides. This would speed things up as I wouldn't need any clamps here. This would leave the ends and long edges open to chamfer with a sanding disc on my angle grinder, then followed by my power plane. And I can lay these out ready for staining. Wow, that turned out to be quite a pile. While my stain was drying, I found the peak angle and bird's mouth on my first pattern was a bit off, and I thought my bird's mouth was also cut into the rafter a bit too deep. So I cut a new pattern from another 1x8 and checked it along the entire length of the greenhouse beams. This change would not affect the tail profile of the rafters I already cut and prepped. Now, there is the option of cutting each bird's mouth individually, but it's much more difficult than using a pattern. And a pattern only works if the beams are consistent, that being that they're parallel to each other vertically and horizontally. This new pattern looked good, so I can trace the bird's mouth onto a rafter. And it very slightly changed my angle at the peak where the rafter meets the ridge beam, and I just shaved a bit off on the miter saw to correct that. For the bird's mouth, I made 2 cuts with my circular saw. Then finished these cuts with a handsaw. Now I can set the first rafter in place. I screwed on a small 1x1 piece at the peak to rest on the ridge beam, and I can use a bar clamp to hold this in place. For the rafters at the end of the beam, I will use screws and a galvanized angle bracket to secure them. At the peak, I ran screws through the ridge beam and into the end of the rafter. Now I'll cut the next rafter and attach it in the same way. The angle brackets work well here and give a cleaner look to the gable end. And at the peak end, I angled in the screws through the ridge beam. After all the prep work on the rafters with the tail profile, chamfering, and staining, it felt great to finally have the first 2 up on the beams, and to see the design becoming a reality. As I continued to cut the bird's mouth on the next rafters, I got into a rhythm and I was able to speed things up, and I started to use my jigsaw to finish the cuts. I made pencil marks along the beams for the location of each rafter, and having 2 ladders is helpful too. And on it went that afternoon, cutting and placing each one, then screwing them to the beams. and this is the last one going up on the north-facing gable end. I next added some 2x4 blocking between the rafters around mid-span. This will add more support for the roof glazing when it's installed later. There's also blocking made from 2x6s that sit on the north-south beam, and that blocking will also help seal up the greenhouse. Both these runs of blocking make for a stronger roof structure and will help prevent any twisting of the rafters over time. At each corner on the inside, I added 2 corner braces. These were cut from the same pattern as the outside ones that I installed in part 2 of this series. Now the wall glazing will add stiffness to the structure. These inside corner braces will help with that, plus I think they look good and complement the ones on the outside. They were easy to cut and easy to attach. Here's the stained fascia boards going onto the ends of the rafters, and I used GRK trim screws for this. And with the structure of the roof complete, I can remove my ridge beam temporary braces. The opening at the gable ends of the greenhouse will need some additional framing to support the polycarbonate glazing and a vent and fan. I've added a 2x4 that sits on the front tie beam here, and I'll add another 2x4 to the inside face of the rafters. Here's the finished framing with a square boxed in for a vent on the front-facing gable end. And similar framing added to the north side with the same size boxed opening, and a fan will be installed there. I'll be making the door from 2x4 and 2x6 cedar. Here I'm laying the pieces out to see how they'll look. And I made a test of the lap joint I'll be using for the corners. This lap was joined with exterior wood glue and GRK screws. I'll start by cutting laps on the ends of the 2 side rails that attach to the 2x6 at the bottom of the door. I have these rails clamped together, and I'll make a series of wafer cuts with my circular saw. Then break these off with a hammer and clean up the lap with a chisel. Cedar is so nice to work with, and it's perfect for this door. Here I have the cross members ganged together with clamps, so I can cut them all at the same time. With all the cuts done, I can lay them on the concrete in front of my shop and square them up. Then lay in some glue, then screws for these 2 bottom corners. Then I did the same for the upper corners. One of my vertical rails had a bow, so I'll need a pipe clamp here to pull this joint together before running in the screws. I'll add glue to the mid-rail dados and set it in place. With the glue dry, I use my router and a straight bit to cut a relief on the inside of the door to accept the polycarbonate panels. And I set the depth of cut the same thickness as the glazing. And I can test fit the 2 panels. Then I stain this door frame and set it aside for later. Before the wall polycarbonate panels are installed, I added some galvanized flashing to the 2x4 sill plate. This will make a drip edge and keep water that's running down the wall from going under the sill plate. I bought 4-foot by 8-foot panels for this greenhouse. The polycarbonate has UV protection on one side only, so I need to consider that when making my cuts and installing them. I use my circular saw with a fine-tooth blade to make my cuts. This blade is made for finishing and cutting some soft metal. I clamped a straight edge to my improvised workspace as a guide for my cuts. I don't yet have a track saw, but I think that would work pretty well here. The UV side has a film of white plastic on it. I got in the habit of always laying the panels across the sawhorses white side up. The other side has a clear film on it. I marked all my screw locations with a Sharpie on the white plastic and drilled pilot holes. This bit is slightly oversized for my screws to allow for expansion and contraction of the panels, and I'll be using roofing screws with a rubber washer here. I need to clean the panel of any tiny plastic chips. These get inside between the walls when I cut the panels and when I drill the pilot holes. It's easy to blow them out with an air nozzle and a compressor. I peeled off some of the white plastic from the bottom end and I'll slide on some J-channel. This will seal the bottom end of the panel to keep bugs and debris out. I used tin snips to cut the J-channel to length and a 1/8 drill bit for the bottom drain holes to allow for condensation or water vapor to escape. And a piece of channel goes on the top edge too. No drain holes though. Now I'll peel off the films and set the panel against the wall studs. And run in screws through the pilot holes. There was some wind the day I was putting these panels up, so I was storing them in the greenhouse. You can see the 2x4s I screwed to these two sawhorses to make an improvised workstation big enough to support the panels, and to give me something to clamp to. I was making a cut mark plus a straight edge alignment mark, and these were 5 inches apart as the edge of the shoe of my circular saw to the blade was also 5 inches. And I was also marking a line with a Sharpie on my cut marks just to be sure I was getting this right. I was surprised how the channels of the polycarbonate panels would fill with chips, and also impressed by how a shot of air from the compressor would clean them out. Then the top followed by the bottom J-channels are slid on the ends. This one needed a trim with the tin snips. After drilling all the pilot holes, I can strip off the white UV side plastic, then the clear film underneath. I think it was about a 1/4 inch gap I left between the panels here to allow for expansion and contraction. I ripped and stained some 3/4 by 3/4 inch strips to cover this gap. I used trim screws that went through the gap between glazing sheets and into the stud, and I thought it looked pretty good. The third sheet finished this wall, and I did need to rip it down vertically to fit. And again a strip of cedar to cover the gap. The roof would require a different strategy to get the panels up and screwed to the rafters. I made some standoffs from a 2x4 and plywood that I clamped to the fascia boards. This would support the panel when I slid it up into place, and also give me a consistent overhang that would line up with the panel before. And to help with spacing and alignment, I attached some thin wood strips to the center of the rafter. And this first sheet needed to be ripped to width as well as cut to length. The length cut is the same as the wall panels with the aluminum straight edge, but it was not long enough for these rip cuts, so I used a strip of plywood. And everything else is the same. Mark and drill the pilot holes for the screws, then blow out the chips with the air compressor, then slide on the upper J-channels. So now I can slide the first roof panel up into place and against the end and side stops. For the next panel, I moved one of the fascia stops down, leaving one to bridge across the panels. Between the panels on the roof, I'll need to slide in an H-channel. This will make a watertight seal and secure the edges. Some dish soap on the H-channel allowed me to slide it up into place without having to tap it with a mallet. After the panels go up, I'll slide on longer lengths of J-channel that will bridge across the gaps. And remembering the lower J-channel needs some drain holes. And I use the 1/8 bit and space the holes around 12 inches apart along the length. Here's the east-facing side of the roof done. And I'll add some clear silicone to the lower J-channel to keep snow from tearing it off in the winter. The next morning, I got to work on the west-facing side, and I was repeating all the steps from the day before. And it was going well. This is the first time I've installed this type of glazing, so as things go, it's slow at the beginning as you're figuring out the best way to handle each task. The H-channel is also held in place with roofing screws. And now the final roof panel is going up. For the ridge cap, I bought two 10-foot lengths of galvanized metal preformed cap. But you don't want metal right against the plastic polycarbonate panels in the sun, so I needed something in between. So I ripped down more of the boards from the concrete forms and glued and nailed them together to form a wooden cap. I made a jig over my sawhorses to hold the pieces of the wood cap in place while I glued and nailed them. And I built up the upper section of the cap with 2 strips of plywood. And I stained everything once it was assembled. And as I was excited to get the roof panels up and happy with how everything was going, I wasn't giving enough thought to the ridge cap. I hadn't completely figured out how I was going to install it. And maybe I should have done that in sections as I was putting up the roof panels. Maybe install the first 2 panels on each side of the roof first, then put on a section of the ridge cap while I can still reach far enough from both ends to run in the screws. And looking back on that might have been the easier way, because now I need to find a way to get up on the finished roof without damaging it. And maybe this was a good thing in the long run. I'd need to find a way to do this if I ever had any damage to repair or a leak to fix, so might as well figure it out now. So here's what I came up with. First, I'd remove the fascia from the tails of the rafters. Then I made some L-shaped brackets that slid over the end of the rafters and held a 2x4 in place. This made a sturdy rail along the entire edge of the west-facing roof. Then I added some 1x8s to the side of an old wooden stepladder I had. This ladder would sit flat against the glazing and across several rafters to distribute my weight and not damage the polycarbonate. Then I could reposition this ladder down the roof as I attached the sections of the ridge cap. Here I'm testing this glazing ladder, as I call it, for the first time. My rubber washer screws were installed in a fixed pattern across the roof, so I drilled holes in the boards attached to the ladder at these locations.
Step up here. Okay,
Do you know if there's any falling, 911 is going to be called immediately.
Oh, yeah.
So just so you know.
And Marilyn steadied the orange ladder while I slowly crawled up on the glazing. And it all looked good and felt sturdy and effective for the task. So now I can set the first section of wooden ridge cap on the peak and slide it into place. And it would have helped if I had installed the uppermost row of roofing screws in the panels a few inches lower and clear of the cap. Well, I didn't, so I drilled some shallow holes with a Forstner bit in the underside of the wooden cap for clearance, and this made the wood cap sit flush down against the panels. I drilled pilot holes directly down from the peak of the cap, so I could run in a long screw through the center of the cap and into the ridge beam, and the screw would go through the small gap between the glazing panels. This worked well and made attaching the wood cap quick and easy. Now I can bring up the first length of metal ridge cap and lay it over the wooden one, and I'll use roofing screws to secure it. I liked how this looked, and it raised the metal cap up and made the entire ridge cap more pronounced, which I think adds to the post and beam aesthetic. And I just repositioned the glazing ladder to give me enough reach for running in all the screws. Then I can install the second piece of cap to finish the roof. This piece overlaps the first, and I added some silicone here before running in the last screws. And the roof is finished. In the next episode, I'll add the door, the gable end glazing, and the vents and fan. Thanks for watching. Leave me a comment or question below, and I'll see you next time.